Hi, my name is Peter Loggins. I'm a superintendent in the PSNI attached to Criminal Justice Department, and I'm leading on the knife crime strategy for the Police Service of Northern Ireland.
What are the statistics of knife crime?
I think it's fair to say that knife crime is not as big an issue as it is in other parts of the United Kingdom, but given the impact that it has on victims, it is still a significant issue in Northern Ireland. Last year we had a reduction in knife crime, and that's to be encouraged. In West Belfast we have seen a reduction of about 16% last year over the previous year, and that downward trend we certainly hope will continue.
In your experience in the PSNI, have you ever had to tell someone their family member was dead?
Yeah, I'm nearly 28 years in the police, and in my first month of working in Tennant Street I went to an incident in the Lower Shankill estate where a woman had stabbed her husband, and that was a very chilling experience to go in and have to witness that. Also extremely difficult to have to go to the family and explain what had happened. I think it is difficult if it has happened by a stranger doing it, but if it's one family member on another, that was extremely difficult, and it's something I wouldn't want to have to do again.
What is the law on knife crime?
There's essentially two bits of legislation in relation to the carriage of knives. One of those is under the Criminal Justice Act, which makes it an offence to carry a bladed or a sharp instrument, and the other is under the Public Order, Northern Ireland Order, which makes it an offence to carry any offensive weapon, and a knife would fall into that category. But it's also an offence if you use a knife whilst you're committing any other offence. It would be treated much more seriously if you were carrying a knife or a knife was used. If you assaulted somebody, that would be bad enough to go in front of the court, but it would make it much worse if it was done with a knife, and the sentence would reflect that and be much more severe.
What are the consequences of carrying a knife?
Well, there's many consequences in relation to carrying a knife, not least of all the consequences for the victim and the victim's family, and the fact that they could be very seriously injured or potentially lose their life. But there's also consequences for the person who has used the knife, and that they would enter the criminal justice system and be dealt with very severely at the courts. The Public Prosecution Service now will prosecute in virtually all cases where a knife has been used. And there's also consequences for other people. If somebody knows that somebody has a knife, we would always encourage them to report that, because they could potentially save a knife. So it's not just having to carry it which makes it an offence. If you know somebody else who carries a knife, we would always encourage you to report it. Not necessarily to the police, because I know that that can be difficult, but to a family member, to a youth worker, to somebody in the school, we would always appeal, because knives ruin lives.
What are the consequences of using a knife?
Again, the consequences of using a knife is that you could come into the criminal justice system, and again, even for a first offence, likely to get a criminal sentence, whether that would be in the youth offending centre or potential on your age straight to jail, and there's different sentences that apply.
What are the possible sentences?
Well, if you carry a knife, and that's not use it for an offence but just carry a knife, if it's prosecuted in the magistrates court, you could get 12 months in prison and a fine of up to £5,000. If it's prosecuted in the Crown Court, you could get 4 years in premises in prison and an unlimited fine, or both. But if you use a knife in any other offence, if you used it to stab somebody, or that would be grievous bodily harm with intent, or you could murder somebody, you could be looking at a life sentence, and you could be looking at 10 years if it was GBH. And that's just not a life sentence for yourself, but you have to think of your own family and how they would have to deal with that.
Yep. Any other questions or anything else you think that needs to go into it?
Reason?
I'm just thinking about, even in relation to